Hello, everyone. This is Zach Baldwin with the American Association of People with Disabilities and the REV Up campaign. Thank you for joining our collaborative webinar today between the REV Up campaign and the Disability Organizing Network called Breaking Barriers to Voting.
Okay, so hi everybody, I'm Elizabeth Campbell and I'm the Systems Change Advocate here at the Dale McIntosh Center. Currently representing the DOnetwork, which is our, stands for the Disability Organizing Network, which is the network of advocates for systems change advocates within California.
One more. Great, thanks. So quick background on the REV Up campaign before we get started today. The REV Up campaign was launched in 2016. We are a nonpartisan initiative that coordinates with national, state, and local disability organizations to increase the political participation of the disability community while also engaging candidates and the media on disability rights issues. The campaign focuses on voter registration, education, access, and engagement. REV Up itself is an acronym. It stands for Register, Educate, Vote, Use Your Power. Next slide, please. So these are a few different resources that we produced collectively as a REV Up campaign this year. You can find all of these at aapd.com/RevUp. These are all freely available to our partners and were developed with a subcommittee of different advocates from around the country. Today's webinar is the third and final in a series addressing various access barriers to the voting process. And today we're focusing on access barriers to actually casting a vote, whether that's done by mail, in person, or early voting, or another format. We've got a great lineup of presenters today, including Christina Majeski, who will talk about polling place accessibility, and she's with Disability Rights DC, the Protection and Advocacy Agency in Washington, DC. Maggie Knowles with the Protection and Advocacy Agency in South Carolina will focus on poll workers and poll worker training. Esther Harlow with Disability Rights Oregon will talk about vote by mail accessibility, and Mark Lehman with Disability Rights Iowa will talk about knowing your rights as a voter with a disability. And then, as I said before, we'll have time for question and answer with everyone at the end of the webinar. So now I'd like to kick us off and turn it over to our first presenter, Christina Majeski.
Thank you for the opportunity to present. I'm going to just be kicking it off by talking about polling accessibility or polling place accessibility from our perspective at Disability Rights DC, and kind of give you a rundown of our work in terms of ensuring accessibility. But first, if we could go to the next slide, Elizabeth. I will start off by talking about protection and advocacy agencies and voting access and where that comes from. So PNAs, we play a crucial role in ensuring that all voters with disabilities are able to cast a vote on election day, both privately and independently. And so every PNA has a staff dedicated to ensuring this accessibility through its PAVA program, which stands for Protection and Advocacy for Voting Access. And this was established as part of the Help America Vote Act of 2002. And under that federal legislation, the PNA agencies are specifically mandated to ensure full participation in the electoral process for individuals with disabilities, which would include registering to vote, casting a vote, and accessing polling places. And the PNAs, as you'll hear today, can fulfill this mandate in variety and different ways. Next slide, please. Great, thanks. So this is just a little intro about the Help America Vote Act, which for the purposes of my presentation, the main point under the law is that it requires full barrier-free access to polling places to enable people with disabilities to cast their votes privately as voters without disabilities do. And it also discusses the need for at least one voting machine that's accessible to individuals with both visual and or mobility disabilities. Next slide. So as part of our outreach here before Election Day, throughout all of our elections here in DC and national elections, we go out and explain to voters what their rights are. And so this is just kind of some of our bullet points that we focus on, that as a person with a disability, you have the right to vote at an actual polling site. In DC, you know, our Board of Elections has curbside voting. It should be available at every site as well, but for those who are interested in voting curbside, but they should always have the option of actually entering their polling place in the main polling site. They have the right to vote independently and privately. Individuals have the right to register to vote, and in DC, we can vote by mail, we can register to vote by mail, online, and through an app that they just launched, the Board of Elections just launched. And you always have the right to register to vote in person on election day, and early voting as well. And then you have the right to request an absentee ballot online, and we've even advocated for individuals to be able to request a general ballot transfer on the day of the election if they show up at their polling site and it's inaccessible. Okay, next slide, thank you. So as part of our efforts, we put together a voting access survey for every election. In DC, the primary elections are particularly important. So we just completed the primary in June and just actually finalized our report. So I'm going to go through kind of where, from start to finish, how we put that together. But our goal is to ensure and promote 100% accessibility for voters with disabilities. And since 2004, with the help of our community and a tremendous cohort of volunteers, we have surveyed polling precincts during both national and DC elections. And then, so we collect and analyze the surveys that we distribute to our volunteers before the election day. And I will go through what those surveys consist of in just the next slide. And then our goal is to issue a written report to the Board of Elections and our City Council and testify about our findings before the City Council's oversight hearings in the following year to report on the accessibility we find and the barriers that we identify. Next slide, I think. So our volunteers are essential to our effort to improve access for all voters in the district. And our volunteers come from the Disability in Maryland and Virginia area. We have volunteers from nonprofits, our self-advocacy groups here in DC, and universities, and even our library. We've partnered with them to have them go out and do our access surveys on election day. And we usually send out a call for volunteers about 2 months out. We contact the Board of Elections to make sure we have the most updated precinct list. And then we ask people to sign up for a few or at least one polling site that they are interested in surveying. And then we have a Google spreadsheet that we use to maintain that effort. And if needed, we provide training and instructions on how to fill out the survey and kind of what it takes to go through this polling place on election day to ensure that it's accessible in all ways. So the next slide talks about our accessibility checklist. And I won't go too much into detail here. I'm mindful of the time, but we developed a 4-page survey that we can certainly share with the group. And that's all on our website at uls-dc.org. But our accessibility takes a volunteer from the street and accessible parking lot to the inside of the polling place, where they look for barriers such as obstruction along the pathway, any abrupt rises, any ramps that are not ADA compliant. If there are no ramps, that's obviously a huge concern. And we also make sure that the inside of the polling site is accessible as well. And so that means that there should be magnifying glasses available, as well as headsets to go into the voting, the accessible voting machines for people who require assistance with having the ballot read to them. And our checklist is based off the Department of Justice's checklist for polling accessibility, which is a more extensive set of standards. And so we modified that checklist, which I've also linked to here, so for the purposes of our survey. Next slide, please. And so following the election day, we ask our volunteers to send back their surveys by mail or fax, and we follow up with any volunteers that had particularly had identified egregious barriers in particular. And then we organize our data in an Excel spreadsheet and analyze the percentages of inaccessibility based on the category of the components of the survey. And then we publish our data in a public report. So the next slide, please, discusses the main categories of physical barriers that we have identified, such as steps. Even one-step entrance could be a complete barrier to people with mobility disabilities. Steep and uneven ramps, especially ones that don't have handrails, are not 36 inches wide or don't have a 5-foot turning radius at the top of the ramp. And obstructed pathways, oftentimes the pathway could be remedied in terms of the obstruction, such as chairs or cars or cones that are in the way. But other times there's abrupt rises or cracks in the ramp that prevent access by individuals or cause hazards. So we keep track of both of those types of obstructions. And oftentimes we'll find narrow or closed heavy doors that individuals cannot independently access or enter. And then also, if there's no designated accessible parking, that is a barrier as well. And then the next slide, please. This is just a couple slides about the different types of barriers that we found in this past election. So there's one photo here on the left that shows a ramp leading to an entrance that unfortunately on election day was locked on the start of election hours. So this prevented individuals from voting for about a few hours on election day. And one of our volunteers called this into the Board of Elections, who had called in a locksmith to come and unlock the door. The other photo shows a double door that has a vertical bar running down the middle of it, which prevented access for people with mobility devices and wheelchairs. The next slide, please. This is a photo of a church that we actually just got changed. This is no longer a polling place in DC, but the way that the main entrance had about 15 stairs going up to the main door. And this shows the importance of the doorbell placement because the doorbell is located at the very top of the entrance. And this was the accessible doorbell. And so there was a complete barrier to people who use wheelchairs or mobility devices. And this was a very problematic precinct over the years, which we've successfully advocated that they relocate to an accessible location. And then the next slide shows a few more barriers. The first photo on the left shows a ramp that's obstructed by overgrown bushes. This could have been remedied prior to election day, but unfortunately this caused a barrier on the June primary election. And then the second photo on this page shows a lot of obstructions, and there was construction at this particular polling site, and so this prevented some voters in wheelchairs from accessing the polls that day. And then the next slide shows even more examples of just some of the hindrances that we found on election day, such as cords running across the ground next to the accessible voting machine. We've asked poll workers to place down heavy mats over such cords to ensure that people who are using wheelchairs could easily access the voting machines without having to get caught up in the cords. And there's another photo of a closed heavy door with no accessible doorbell located next to it, and a steep incline to enter the polling site. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so some additional barriers that we've monitored are limited transportation options. And we understand that's more of a problem in rural states. DC, does have a robust public transportation system. And I understand that Uber and Lyft and other shared ride organizations sometimes put out a call for rides on election day as well. We've kept track of our voting machines to ensure that they're accessible on election day and have worked with our Board of Elections to do demonstrations with our community members. We've seen a lack of privacy. Oftentimes, if the voting machines are not placed far enough apart or the privacy tabs are not put up on election day, that can cause a problem. And we've also have seen and reported on the misinformation about voter eligibility and made sure that people in DC are aware that just in DC it's very state by state, but guardianship is not a barrier to voting. And so we make sure that our constituents understand that that is not a complete bar to voting. So when we go out to do our outreach, that's something that we focus on. And it's important to understand what your guardianship rules are in your state. Next slide, please. So part of our effort is not only to identify the problems and report them, but to recommend solutions. And we've been in close contact with our Board of Elections and ADA coordinator at the Board of Elections about our survey findings throughout the years, so as to hopefully ensure 100% accessibility eventually. And so we've asked, one of our biggest asks is to unlock closed heavy doors and ensure that they are propped open on election day. And so in the past, DC has cited security concerns for a lot of their polling precincts because a lot of them were schools. And so this year, the schools were closed on election day, and we saw a tremendous increase in the amount of doors that were propped open, therefore allowing individuals to independently access the polls, which was a great win for our community. And then we also have asked and advocated for the installation of permanent and/or temporary ramps on election day, especially if there's an entrance that's not near a curb cut. We've asked for portable ramps to be installed. And then ensuring that there's accessible parking places, removing obstructions along the pathway, and also ensuring that there's enough signage to guide a voter from the street or accessible parking area into the accessible entrance. The next slide, please. So if you are interested in working with your community and Board of Elections and state officials to increase accessibility, part of our efforts and what we encourage is to work with your election officials, and if they have an ADA accessibility specialist or coordinator that can assist, we encourage you to build partnerships if you haven't already done so. And we've attended here in DC, and Zach has been a part of this as well, but voter access forums that the Board of Elections has scheduled. And we go as stakeholders and community members to share our experiences on behalf of the advocacy community. And then testifying before City Council or in your state legislatures about the barriers that you've identified or things that you want to see on election day. And next slide. So the next two slides show 2 polling precincts and 2 fixes that we've seen in DC. So the first picture shows a temporary portable ramp that was set down in front of an accessible entrance at one of the polling precincts to fix the barrier of there not being a curb cut close enough to the accessible parking space. And then the next picture shows that the double doors that had been closed in past elections have been propped open at this church that was a polling precinct. There was one entrance that was very narrow for voters in wheelchairs to enter, and so they agreed to open the wider entrance and remove the vertical bar at the center. So those are just examples of solutions that we've advocated for with our Board of Elections. And then the next slide just shows who to contact for help on election day if you experience barriers to voting on behalf of you or anyone in your community. And my contact information and my managing attorney's contact information is on the last slide. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and I look forward to hearing any questions you have at the end of the webinar.
Great. Thank you so much, Christina. So I will introduce Maggie Knowles with Protection and Advocacy for People with Disabilities, the Protection and Advocacy Agency in South Carolina. Maggie, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
All right, great, thank you. So great transition because we do a lot of the same work here in South Carolina with our PAVA grant. We go out and survey locations, and for years we've worked with our county and state election officials. and just never seemed to be able to make enough changes at the ground level. And so recently we have started trying to work more with poll workers and have found great success in this. So this is kind of another step, another way. You don't have to do surveys beforehand, but it's another great way to initiate changes and reduce barriers. If you'll move to the next slide. So poll workers are wonderful people. They work a couple days a year. They get paid very little money, at least here in South Carolina. They get very little training for a vast amount of information that they need to know how to do. So they don't intend to be barriers, but unfortunately we found that they constantly are. And despite whatever training the county and state officials have and know about, they just don't seem to always be able to get this to the ground level, to the poll workers. So some of the barriers we've really found that poll workers can kind of cause themselves is, number one, that they aren't aware of how to set up the accessible voting machines. In the 2014 election, I had 6 callers who were blind who wanted to use our audio ballot, and were just point blank told, I have no idea how to do that. You'll have to have somebody vote for you. So they just don't use them a lot. It's not necessarily something they're familiar with. They were trained how to do it once, and it's just not something they know how to do regularly. We also just don't think they seem to be aware of all the rights of voters with disabilities. So even though a voter might know their rights and might know their right to assistance or something else, the poll workers don't always seem to know this, and so people will be denied the right to assistance. And we also find that poll workers tend to question people with hidden disabilities, where a poll worker might be extremely accommodating for somebody with a disability that they can see, or one that they're familiar with or understand. Somebody that maybe, let's say, has MS that they don't understand or see, that they question this disability and the need for accommodations. And so we have a lot of problems with that. We do find that a number of poll workers force assistance on people with disabilities who don't need it, that have the right to vote privately and independently. And similarly, we have them deny assistance. I have one story of a voter who said she lives in this very small town, and the poll worker knew her whole life. And she said, I know my right. I have a disability and I'm allowed an assistant, and I want my mom to assist me. And he said, no, you're not disabled enough. You don't need it. So we certainly, whether you're in a big city or a small town, community dynamics and the history of the area can always play a part. We've also found, I have a picture of one, that poll workers have physically placed barriers in the pathways. So we've had some great pictures of things like bushes and walkways. Well, we've also had just poll workers purposely position signs in the middle of the curb cut and things like that, where they're not meaning to cause a problem, but that's exactly what they do. And then, of course, we all know that some people just treat other people rudely, and we're not sure why. So some of the quotes we've had directly from poll workers that just to give an example of what we see out there when we go out to do our polling place surveys, is when we have asked them where their curbside voting is, we've been told that no one's ever complained, so it's not a problem here, that people who need assistance know where to go for help, and they always know what their options are. We've been told that dealing with disabled voters is not a problem in my town because I know every voter in my precinct. I've lived here my whole life. We've been told that disabled people can't drive, so their driver can do that. We've been told that they're too busy serving voters to check curbside, and if they want to vote, they have to come inside. And a voter who called us with a complaint, said that a poll worker told her that your problem must be mental because I don't see anything wrong with you. So obviously we have a lot of misconceptions and just discriminatory practices out there. And I don't think that those are all completely typical of all poll workers, but it's a reason to try to start outreach with your poll workers. And so that's why we've moved forward with trying to train poll workers. Next slide. So obviously, if you want to try to train your poll workers, you're going to have to start with building relationships with your county election officials to do this. The type of trainings that poll workers get is going to vary from state to state and location to location. Here, there is a booklet and manual that's produced by the state, and then the county election officials have to provide the in-person training that can really vary in the content and time that's provided for them. So through building relationships with the county directors, I've been able to work out that for some of them, I just provide them materials to add to their trainings, train their staff, and their staff add the material to the trainings. And in other locations, I've been able to work out where I am a guest speaker and actually come to the locations to train them. So both of these have been very effective methodologies. I added links here to two of the things I've produced for when I am just handing it off kind of to their staff. When I'm training the staff and they're going to go train the poll workers, I find it really helpful to have things in writing and have pictures for examples. So I've produced two of those documents there for that. I try to focus on just a few quick things because I don't usually have a whole lot of time to work on things. So the first thing I work on is how to quickly survey a location for barriers, and then how to install a temporary quick fix. So often when I hear from a county director is that they've already been to the location and they've certified that it's good to go, but then somehow at the last minute, a barrier gets into place. The school changes something, maybe they change it from the gym to the cafeteria, or something else at the last minute happens. So by training the poll workers to walk through from the parking lot to the voting machine to look for those barriers and how to replace them works very, very well. The second one is just on first person language. I am amazed at how many people say that they love having this, that they never know what to say to anyone anymore, that PC language changes so constantly. They're scared to say anything because they want to be respectful. They just don't know what is respectful anymore. So we go through that. We talk about when and how to offer assistance. And then we review the different types of disabilities and the possible barriers in the voting process for these different categories. And this is very helpful so that they can anticipate what might be a problem and try to fix it beforehand. And then we review the basics of accessibility, all the stuff that you just went over with polling places, because they've often known nothing of this themselves. And then we ask them for examples of situations of problems they've had, or things they didn't know what to do, and offer them good ideas. Sometimes we do some role playing, and we usually find that this kind of more hands-on talking through it time is actually the best time, because most of them want to do better, and they all have a situation where they know they failed the voter and they want to know how to correct it. And so that's always been a really good time, is to really have some discussion time. Next page. So I've included a couple pictures here of some of the things that I focus on when training. So we talked a lot about the polling place accessibility standards. One of the things that a lot of people don't know is that polling places are allowed to have temporary accessible measures on election day. Because the county election commission does not own the polling place, it is a school or a church, and they're just there for the day, they're allowed to temporarily fix it. So teaching them what these temporary measures are and how to make them work is one of the things we focus on. So this picture is of a temporary accessible parking space and access aisle. And we were finding that people could figure out how to make a temporary accessible parking space pretty easily, but they were having a really hard time with the access aisle, because when they were making it, they were often blocking out the entire parking space, so that then you couldn't get a van left in or out of the space, and that people would just move the type of barriers that they would add. So by teaching them to kind of put signs up that are shown in this picture, it says this is an access aisle, do not move this cone. it kind of worked a lot better for them to try to make sure that other people didn't move the cone and then just park in that parking space. Next picture. We also just try to teach them. We had some great pictures of portable ramps in the last one. This is just fixing thresholds is one of the most common things we find that need fixing. So it shows a bad doorway with a large 3 to 4 inch lip and a temporary threshold coming in to fix it with a small plate, and how easy it is for the Election Commission to have that on hand and then put that in place for the poll workers. Next slide. This picture is that we try to teach them to include a place to sit. We, for some reason here in South Carolina, had a lot of resistance to this because they didn't want people getting out of line, and then they were having people fight over the chairs and all kinds of stuff. But we've specifically really tried to push that every polling location should have some chairs designated, so that if people can't stand in line, then often with large elections, there's a 1 or 2 hour wait to vote, that there needs to be some type of place to sit down. And the next picture. And then we teach them to put cones. This picture is of a large old-fashioned water fountain hanging off the side of a wall in an old school. And we try to teach them to put cones or chairs, other cane detectable barriers under protruding objects, as we find this to be one of the really common, easily fixable barriers that we have at a lot of our locations. We have a lot of old schools that are used in South Carolina that have these old water fountains. And some other barriers on the walls. Next one. And this is this next picture is a picture of a row of voting machines and then one voting machine at a wheelchair accessible height on a table. In South Carolina, all of our voting machines are at standing height. And so we've had to fight to get them, at least one of them, the accessible one, placed at a lower level. That way they can be easily accessed. And we've had a lot of good success with this, actually. People have found, they're like, oh, well, that's easy to do, and it's an easy fix. They just didn't know to do it. So by getting to the poll workers directly, we've been able to get them to change this practice and make sure that there's one that's easy to reach. Next picture. So then talking about the next section, that's pretty much our poll worker training. One of the things that we try to teach voters is how to resolve their problems at the polling places and how to advocate for your rights. There's so many barriers out there. What do you do when you come across something? So what we always tell them is to first ask for the poll manager in charge. This is different at every location, but this poll manager in charge is often going to be the more experienced poll manager. Many of the other poll managers might have that might be their very first day on the job. So they might have no idea that they're denying you something that you're allowed, and they're going to be scared to make any kind of decision on their own. If the poll manager in charge is unable to resolve the matter, we always ask them here to call their county board of voter registration and elections. And by doing that, they are, you don't have to get into a fight with that person. You don't have to, make an issue with it. And it's also easier for the poll manager to call the county rather than yourself, because they have a direct line to their supervisor. So believe me, they have very easy communication. Whereas if you try to call your county board, you may, but you're going to end up on hold for a very long time trying to get through on election day, because it's going to be really busy. If the matter's still not resolved, we usually ask the poll manager to call the state election commission, and sometimes they will intervene with the county. And then after that is when we say, if you're unable to resolve methods right there on site, because that is going to be the easiest way to ensure that you get a vote and cast your ballot, and that it is found. We then suggest that you go to an outside organization. Can you go to the next slide, please? Oh, so before I go to outside organizations, this was just an example of the something that we put together in South Carolina that said, are you having trouble voting? And it's a handout that we gave people that just went through those 4 steps that I went through, that you can hand out, that we hand out to people because we were asked to have something that they could put in their wallet for how to resolve those problems. So outside organizations, there's more in some states, so this certainly isn't a full list. But if it's a disability related problem, we always suggest people contact their P&A first. As you discussed, every P&A has staff that works on voting issues. And the link here will provide you to the national network that will give you the list of the P&As in every state and how you can contact them. And so they're really the best point of first reference. We can help you resolve problems. We can help you make sure you cast your vote. And if there's a major problem, then we can work with that, the officials there to resolve that problem. I think Christina mentioned getting a polling place location moved, and we do things like that. So that is a common activity. The next thing would be that there is the Americans with Disabilities Act does have a complaint form online that people can fill out if their polling place isn't accessible. The third thing is the Help America Vote Act has a complaint form. Now this does not cover everything with voting. It covers certain things, but it covers mostly your machines, provisional voting, and your computerized statewide voter registration list. So if any of those things have problems, you can fill out one of those forms. Now, I couldn't put a link on this because each state has their own form for a HAVA complaint form. But if you Google it, you should be able to find it. And the last one I put down is election protection. They are a wonderful national network, national organization that collects and tries to solve election problems. And if it's not a disability specific problem, they're probably one of the first contacts, but usually, at least in our state, if it's a disability related problem, the election protection people will actually call the P&A and ask us to fix it because they just don't know those laws as well. So in those cases, we always suggest calling the P&A first. And that is pretty much everything.
Great. Thank you so much, Maggie. And just a quick note. So Maggie shared some great resources around poll worker training from her organization, the P&A in South Carolina. We have those linked as well as resources from a number of other P&As in our Rev Up Election Accessibility Toolkit, which you can find at aapd.com/revup. And now we will transition to our next speaker, Esther Harlow with Disability Rights Oregon. Esther, please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. My name is Esther Harlow, and I'm the voting rights advocate at Disability Rights Oregon. And I want to thank Christina for describing what the PAVA program does. I run the PAVA program for Disability Rights Oregon. And I'm going to talk about how we vote in Oregon, which is vote by mail, and then the accessibility options that we have for vote by mail, which includes alternate format ballots. We, along with Washington and Colorado, have pretty unique systems that do help a lot with accessibility. Next slide, thank you. So we have voting by mail. I think this year we're celebrating 20 years, actually, since we passed vote by mail statewide, which means that we effectively do not have polling places. We do have county clerks, elections offices in every county in the state who run the elections at the county level. And so those are the de facto polling places for people who need assistance and go in to get assistance leading up to Election Day. But for the most part, we're conducting all of our elections by mail. So ballots are mailed 15 to 20 days before the election. So yesterday, actually, ballots started going out for this upcoming November 6th election. And most people receive them today, tomorrow, over the next few days. I have a bunch of friends who already got them yesterday and already voted. So it's a great tool for getting out the vote early. You know, in other states, you may have to opt in to early voting or permanent absentee voting or permanent vote by mail. Here, it's completely automatic. So every single voter is getting a ballot in the mail that's giving them the opportunity to vote. We also get a state voters pamphlet that's created by the State Elections Division, and that is mailed to every U.S. Postal Service address in the state. And I'm just going to show you mine. And I'm holding up in the video the state voters pamphlet. And this is basically the ballot measures, and all the candidates can put in the arguments why you should vote for them. And I'm opening the book to show you there's pictures of candidates with the name of candidates and their text, usually about half a page, describing why you should vote for them. And then for the ballot measures, campaigns can submit statements for and against the ballot measures. So I'm opening it to a ballot measure page, and you can see a lot of text describing arguments for and against these ballot measures. So all voters are getting this piece of mail in the state, the voters pamphlet and their ballot. So those both function as a way of reminding people, hey, you should vote. We don't have to remember which day is election day. We don't have to take time off work. We don't have to arrange transportation. We get it in the mail, and it's just sitting there, and voters can vote whenever they choose for basically almost up to 3 weeks before election day. So that's really a huge benefit of the vote by mails. It gives people a lot of time to consider their decisions, a lot of time to get out the vote touches, you know, letters, mailers, phone calls, door knocks from campaigns in the urban areas. And it just gives a lot of time for excitement and community discussion about issues and candidates to ramp up over a period of time. So then when it is election day, ballots are due by 8 p.m. We have ballot official drop boxes all over the state, at least 2 in every county. We have 37 counties. Some are very rural, very large. Eastern Oregon alone is larger than, I think, North Dakota geographically. So there's just some counties that have like a population of 1,000, and they're very large counties. But in urban areas like Portland, the largest city in Oregon, we have dozens of mailboxes. They're at all the county libraries. They're in public parks. They're in the elections office and community centers. And in rural areas in Oregon, they might be in the general store in a small town. There's a ballot drop site in a general store that's in a small town in rural Oregon. They're in the parking lot of a DHS office that serves that county. So there's drop sites all over the state. And for people who want to mail it, one issue is that they do have to be mailed to arrive by election day. Postmarks do not count. So that's an issue that advocacy groups are looking at. And also the postage issue, which is that the Postal Service has a policy that they will deliver all ballots that are sent by mail, regardless of whether there's sufficient postage. But of course, when it comes down to the individual Postal Service worker, that policy may not always be adhered to. So in Oregon, postage is an issue. There's actually also an advocacy movement that we're a part of to bring legislation to make sure that we don't have to provide postage on our ballots. And I believe that's what they do in Washington, which is also a vote by mail state. Postage, I believe, is no longer required for ballots. The other piece of the returning the ballots is that the envelope has to be signed. That is basically our form of voter ID to ensure that the person turning in the ballot is the person who is registered to vote, rather than someone who may be committing fraud or turning it in for someone else. So we keep everyone's signature on file with their registration. and all the signatures from all the times they've ever registered are kept on file. And as you can imagine, that does bring up concerns for people who are unable to sign. So we have a process called signature stamp attestation, which allows for the use of a stamp or another mark as your signature. And that is our way of making sure that people who use a stamp or a mark that is not a traditional signature have an option to sign their ballot to verify that it was them. But of course, their stamp or other mark needs to be on file with their registration as well. And I know this has come up in other states where mismatches between the registration and the ballot were an issue. I believe the ACLU filed a suit in New Hampshire because those ones that were mismatched were being thrown out and not counted without any notice to the voter. In Oregon, if there is a mismatch, so for instance, if someone's signature changed because they had a stroke and they didn't update their registration since then, and then they voted and their signature looked different, all of those voters get a letter back after the election that says your signature didn't count. You have 2 weeks to fix this. You can update your registration with your new signature and send in your ballot, and your vote will be counted. So we have a mechanism in place to make sure that even people whose signature may have changed due to a disability have an opportunity after the election to have their vote counted. And for the spot on the signature on the envelope, there is a tactile signature guide. There's a hole punch in the envelope, and the line to sign is right next to that. So for blind or low vision users who need to sign, they can feel where on their envelope they need to sign. Next slide, please. So voting by mail, the accessibility improvements that it's brought, there's a lot of evidence pointing to convenience voting, so-called convenience voting, like early in-person voting, permanent absentee voting, and vote by mail tend to correlate with higher turnout of people with disabilities. Turnout is pretty consistently high in Oregon. There's probably a lot of factors that go into that, but vote by mail is definitely one contributing factor. And like I said, people also have a long time to think about their choices, and for those get out the vote touches that really do tend to increase voter turnout. It is public information about who's turned in their ballot already. So if I turn in my ballot today, when I get it, my vote will be counted this weekend, and campaigns are going to see I already voted. They're going to stop sending mailers to me. Whereas people who don't turn in their ballot keep getting those touches up through November 6th. So it really gives campaigns an opportunity to do those touches that increase voting behavior, and it gives voters an opportunity to think about their decisions and get repeated reminders over a long period of time, and to have the opportunity for a long time to vote. The fact that we effectively don't have polling places mitigates most of those accessibility challenges. Like I said, if someone does need in-person assistance and they need to go to an elections office, that can pose an accessibility issue. I've also been working with the county clerks to make sure that all the ballot boxes are accessible. The bigger ballot boxes tend to be these mass-produced big metal things that are at an accessible height, but then for some of these temporary ballot boxes, like in the general store, there's concerns that the boxes are at a placement that's too tall to place your ballot in, or too far of a reach, or that the location itself might not be accessible. So I've been having conversations with the county clerks about how to mitigate some of those. I've done training on the ADA polling place checklist, and we're looking to do a survey in the near future. So other access challenges is that some advocates and activists don't like the lack of visibility of people with disabilities at polling places. We don't have, and that's kind of a general concern. Sometimes you'll say to people in other states, we vote by mail, and people say, I love going out with my community and going to the elementary school and being with all my neighbors to vote. So we do have that lack of cohesive community visibility around voting. I think that that's made up for by the fact that, you know, it's in the news, you're getting mail for 3 weeks, and that you have your ballot in your hands to vote for 3 weeks or 2 weeks. So, but those are concerns that some people cite. And then the other issue is that since it is decentralized, people don't know where to go or what to do when they have a voting problem. You know, obviously, if you go to a polling place, well, then you complain to the poll worker. There's a face. Here, people are not really sure where to call. They might call the state, or they might call me, or they might call the county, or they might call, you know, some local government like the city, because they don't know who else to call. So that is one issue, is sort of this decentralization. So let's see. Next slide, I'm going to move into talking about accessibility and some of the alternate formats that we have. So one major accessibility feature that we have is the alternate format ballot. And I think some other states have started using it now. I believe California has a very similar system. I think Ohio may have started using a similar system. So the alternate format ballot is available to all voters through the state elections website. And any voter can log in with their name and date of birth, and they can use their own computer and screen reader to mark the ballot. It's basically just an HTML web page, and you go on and it has all of your candidates and all of your measures for your specific district. And so for instance, if you're a blind or low vision user who uses a screen reader, you can read the ballot on the screen and navigate it through it with your keyboard like you do with any other website, and use your keyboard to mark the choices just like you do with any other form online. And it can be filled out with any accessible technology. So for instance, if you're a person with motor impairments who uses a joystick or toggle buttons to fill out forms, you can do that. And then it still has to be printed and returned in the signed envelope. So of course that is a barrier if you don't have a printer, which most people don't. So I believe if you go to the next slide, I have an example here. It's a picture of the alternate format ballot from 2 years ago for me, and it's a picture of the web page, and it has the instructions, and it explains that you can select the box of your choice, and that you can also write in candidates by checking that box and then typing the person's name who you want to write in. And then it has the boxes. And if you move to the next slide, it shows a ballot measure on the next slide that's talking about transportation funding. And then there's boxes to click yes or no. So you can choose if you want to vote yes or no. And then there's a button to check this measure for voting mistakes. So that button will warn you if you didn't select anything or if you selected both yes and no. And so that's an opportunity for someone to verify how they voted. And then there's a button to check ballot for mistakes, again, and that will check the entire thing for those same types of errors, or if you skipped a race, or if you voted for multiple candidates, or any error like that. And then there's a button for show your ballot summary page, and that takes you to a page that shows all of the races and measures and shows who you voted for and what you voted yes and no on. And then from there, someone will have the opportunity to print it. So again, that's something that any voter can access on the website. So I can go online right now on OregonVotes.gov, put in my name and date of birth, and access my ballot for this election. So a lot of users who are pretty savvy and keyed in, they actually get it emailed to them directly, and they go on the website and they print it out, and then they put it in the envelope that they get in the mail. So if you can go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about users who don't have their own computer or printer. We have accessible voting units. So if someone doesn't have their own technology to access that alternate format ballot, all the elections offices have computers in their office, and they also have these Surface tablets All of them have 2 of them. And there's a picture showing an older user. This was a woman that I met doing outreach at a blind and low vision group. And she is touching the screen on the tablet, and the tablet has a keyboard below it. And the tablet shows a race with several candidates. And the tablet allows you to magnify it. So for low vision users, you can have it really magnified pretty large. And it allows the screen reader. So for someone who doesn't have their own screen reader, that can be provided. And you can also plug in any kind of accessibility device that connects to USB, like toggle buttons, a joystick, a keyboard for people who are comfortable navigating with a keyboard. And, oh, okay, I'm running out of time, so I will move to the next page. Next slide, please. Alternate format ballot. Sorry, there you go, thank you. So accessibility improvements, this provides the convenience of at-home voting to users who can't access the print ballot, who can't read or fill it out independently. And the elections office can provide that accommodation. They can even bring the Surface tablet to someone's home if someone is not able to have that technology at their home. Access challenges, people don't know about it. We're still trying to get the word out there. That's a lot of our outreach and education is focused on that. A lot of people still depend on their family or other supporters to assist them to read and fill out their ballot because that's faster and easier than using its new technology. There's also the issue of workers who are temporary staff hired through elections and the staff who don't use the equipment very often. I worked with a voter who was not able to vote in the May 2016 primary because the Wi-Fi didn't work and then the website didn't work and there were issues like that. So we made sure she was able to vote in the November general election in 2016 and offered to help her file a HAVA complaint. And so, sorry, next slide, please. Returning ballots, and I touched on this, we have multiple drop boxes in every county, accessibility improvements, there's the convenience of returning ballots, and access challenges. I think I already talked about this with postage, postmarks don't count, concerns about accessibility of the ballot boxes. Next slide, please. And there's a picture of one of the official ballot boxes. This is a big metal box with a little slot that you can reach into. And next slide. Here's an example of a temporary ballot box. This is kind of a plastic bin that's placed on top of a shelf at a library. And that is clearly too high for a wheelchair user to reach into to deposit their ballot. So that's an issue I've brought to the elections officers and train them on. So last slide. Vote by mail can be huge cost savings. Those savings should be used to make accessibility improvements to make sure that vote by mail is fully accessible. Election staff still have to be trained and practice using the technologies. And there needs to be a lot of outreach and education about those technologies and assistance that are available to make sure that voters have private and independent voting options. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Esther. And now we'll move on to Mark Lehman with Disability Rights Iowa.
Thank you, Zach. Okay, I want to talk today about your individual voting rights, but first what I want to do is, let's go to the next slide. I want to review the legislation that got us here today and gave us our voting rights and so forth. So I'll start out with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. What it does, it allows a voter who has a disability to receive assistance from a person of the voter's choice, as long as it is not their employer, employer's agent, or union rep. It also prohibits conditioning the right to vote on a citizen's ability to read, write, attain a certain level of education, or pass a test. Then in 1984 was the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act, requires accessible polling places for federal elections or an alternative means of voting on election day. And then we had the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Title II requires the state and local governments to ensure that individuals with disabilities have full and equal voting opportunities. The ADA also provides a checklist for polling places. Next slide, please. Then in 1993 came the National Voter Registration Act. It requires that all offices that offer state-funded programs or public assistance, primarily to individuals with disabilities, also provide the opportunity to register to vote in federal elections. And then came the granddaddy of all, the Help America Vote Act of 2002. Requires election jurisdictions to make polling places fully accessible for individuals with disabilities, provide information on the location of accessible polling places, and adopt voting procedures that enable these individuals to vote privately and independently. It further provides training for election officials and poll workers regarding rights of voters with disabilities and best practices in working with them. Funds are also provided for developing proficiency in the use of voting systems and technologies for individuals with disabilities. Okay, next slide. And one more. So I'm going to talk about federal elections first, some of your federal rights and so forth. So first off, your eligibility. You can vote if you're 18 years of age, registered to vote, and not a convicted felon. You are also entitled to the right to vote privately and independently as you wish. Next slide. You also have the right to vote by yourself or with help. If you bring someone to help you, they cannot be your employer, employer's agent, or representative from your union. You also have the right to be told the correct precinct location. If you happen to show up at the wrong precinct, which as a poll worker, I have seen many times. So next slide. You also have the right to an accessible polling place with voting machines for voters with disabilities. If there is no accessible location, then an alternative means of voting must be provided, which as an example may be curbside voting or perhaps a satellite location for voting. So, you also have the right to have a service animal present while completing the voting process. Next slide. Now this is very important, the next one I'm going to talk about here. You have the right to cast a provisional ballot if your eligibility to vote is challenged in any way. So as P&A advocates, the people and the clients that we deal with and so forth, that is very important to emphasize to them that when you go to a polling place and someone questions anything about your right to vote, you make sure that before you leave that polling place, you cast a provisional ballot. Now, it may be that you have to follow up and provide some information later, but at least you're able to provide that ballot that evening. Don't let anyone turn you away from a polling place unless you have done that. So, next item, you have the right to ask a poll worker for help on how to cast your ballot. And once again, as I mentioned, as a poll worker, I've had that happen to me many times. And you know, hopefully the poll worker will provide you with assistance, friendly assistance, to get that vote cast. Also, you can file a complaint if you think your rights have been denied or you witness voter intimidation. And whether or not you think or know it's voter intimidation, if you have any questions, please call the hotline. In the state of Iowa here, we happen to have several different hotlines that are out there. The Secretary of State, who is the Director of Elections, has a hotline that, as my understanding is fairly busy on election night and so forth. So if you feel that you have any way that your rights have been infringed upon, please call that hotline or please call any other hotline that may be available, including the Department of Justice. So next slide. So that's typical of most of the voting rights for the federal elections and so forth. We have additional voting rights for the state of Iowa. And as I mentioned here, some states will have these, some will not. You just need to check your individual state's laws and see what is the rule regarding elections out there. So next slide. In the state of Iowa, you can register at your designated precinct with proof of residence and a state-approved ID on election day. So we have basically same-day registration on the election day. We have in Iowa a new voter ID law, and it's in what they call a soft rollout. So that for this year 2018, I'm going to touch on this a little bit later, but for the year 2018, you do not have to provide a state-approved ID. You can actually go in there and sign an oath saying that you are the voter that you are, your name and address and so forth, and you can have the right to vote in that precinct. So in Iowa, you also have the right to cast a vote, even if you have a guardian or conservator, unless that right has been taken away by a separate court order. So well, I've seen situations where someone has come into the polling place and someone questioned whether or not they had that right to vote because they had a guardian and so forth. And unless they can prove that there is a separate court order giving that right away, that individual has that right to vote. So, also in Iowa, you can bring a sample ballot to the polls to help you vote, and there is one typically published several weeks ahead of the election. Next slide, please. You also have a right in Iowa to use a signature stamp if you're unable to sign your name on the voter acknowledgement form. And typically, that's in there because if you have a disease that's ongoing, such as MS and so forth, that robs you of your ability to sign, you can use a signature stamp. Now, we also have in Iowa the ability to update your signature that is on file if there are questions about your signature verification. So you can actually do that day on election day. If you're at the polling place, you can ask for the ability to update your signature and go ahead and use that signature for that election and for all the elections to come in the future. So you also have the right in Iowa to curbside vote from the safety of your own vehicle if, due to your disability, you cannot enter the polling place. That does not stop someone who wants to come in and vote. That just gives them the option to, whether or not they have someone drive them to the polling place or they drive to the polling place themselves. And this is not just a physical disability. This may be a mental health issue also. So when that happens during a curbside vote, the polling place will send out 2 judges, one Democrat and one Republican. They will bring the ballot out and an oath for the voter to sign, and the voter then can make their decisions and so forth. And then we'll return it to the 2 judges that came out, and they will bring that back in and cast that vote for the individual. So next slide, please. Here's another important issue that many times voters are either unaware of the way the law reads or just, not sure and so forth. But even if you're in the line after the polling place closes, you still are allowed the right to vote as long as you are there at closing time in that line. So no one can be able to walk up to you and tell you that voting's over, you need to leave the line and so forth. If you are there, if that polling place closes at 9 p.m. at night or 8 p.m. or whatever it is, if you're there in line, you are allowed the right to vote. So don't let anybody tell your client or individual or someone you know that's in there to vote, especially someone with a disability. Don't get out of line. Stay there. So, and now I mentioned that the state of Iowa has a voter ID issue, new laws and so forth. And in 2018, if you have no ID and you sign the oath that I mentioned before, you can vote a regular ballot. In 2019, when the law comes into full effect, you will have to vote a provisional ballot if you have no ID. So, and I want to expound on that a little bit on the ID issue and some of the other things that we're doing as P&A in the state of Iowa. We've worked hard to develop our relationship with the Secretary of State's office. We're doing a partnership project with them right now as regards to curbside voting as far as signage. So we've tried to cultivate that relationship to make sure that they consider us a good resource to consider and to ask questions about individuals with disabilities when they're voting and so forth. So I think that's very important that all the P&As and especially establish that relationship. And I think it might have been Maggie earlier that mentioned the relationship with the counties and so forth, because the county is the online authority right there. They're the ones that run the elections and so forth. The Secretary of State really just lets them do that. They provide the law and guidance, but then the counties are the ones that do the elections and administer the elections and so forth. So get that relationship going. We're actually doing poll worker training with some of the counties this year up to the election. And so I'm really, really excited about that. And that comes also with some information from South Carolina. So develop relationships, go out there and do as much training as you can, make sure that individuals and counties and the state are aware of the rights of the individuals with disabilities and the special needs that they have. to, you know, a lot of it is just common sense. When you go into that polling place and as a poll worker, you know, you always want to check the path in to make sure the individuals can get in there. There's no barriers and so forth, and they can get through that polling place with some type of continuity and so forth. So, but I also, as I talk to my fellow poll workers in the precinct I work at, I'm just trying to tell them, please be patient, because individuals have special needs. You need to be patient to work with those individuals. So that's all I have on the presentation. If you have other questions, you know, please let me know afterwards.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. And that's a good transition now. We've got questions.
So first question, how much education is being offered by PNAs and other advocacy organizations to group home staff and parents who are guardians? Is this an education gap that needs to be addressed to improve voter turnout? Also, this is a three-part question. Has there ever been a large survey of group homes to determine how big of a barrier to voting for this group of people?
This is Maggie. I don't mind addressing that. I can only speak for myself for this PNA in South Carolina. We have tried to work really hard to outreach to specifically group homes, residentials, institutions. It is a barrier. It can be hard to reach them for voting outreach. But quite often when we do, we're able to reach them through, you know, lots of them have associations, the larger associations. So in South Carolina, they're called community residential centers, and they have associations regionally where they have conferences, and we're able to go have presentations and speak to them. Many of the people that work there are really hesitant to help people vote because they don't know what the rules are, they don't know what the regulations are. So after we can reach them, you know, I get tons of questions from them. They keep up contact. And I think they do a lot of it, but until they have someone telling them that it's okay to do this, and these are the rights and these are what the policies are, they tend to be very hesitant to do it on their own.
And this is Christina from Disability Rights DC. I just wanted to add to that. In our district, you know, we have gone out as well and done some outreach at the nursing homes, and obviously it's a little smaller scale here in the district. So we make sure to get out to as many nursing homes as we can, and also the senior buildings to present on a Know Your Rights presentation. But we have also seen some nursing homes that we put in contact with the Board of Elections, and they have had the voting machines actually go, and people from Board of Elections will actually go to the nursing homes during the early voting period here in DC, if not on election day itself. And they'll bring the machines there so that individuals and residents can vote. But it's always important also to make sure, like Maggie said, that the staff understands who can vote and what the rules are around voting, because oftentimes people will assume if a person was convicted, or if there's guardianship involved, or if they were living in a nursing home, that by itself prevents people from voting, which are all untrue. So that's just something that we, I think, could partner with more in that regard.
Hi, this is Esther from Disability Rights Oregon. And I also wanted to say that because we have vote by mail and the county elections offices therefore have more resources to devote to outreach because they don't have to train poll workers. Our largest counties, Multnomah and Washington, where Portland, Beaverton, Hillsborough, the Portland metro region, they do outreach to assisted living facilities and retirement homes. They actually have a team, and they hire temporary workers for the month leading up to the elections. And they do outreach. They have whole lists, and they send out an offer to come to the facility and assist voters and make sure voters have a chance to turn in their ballots directly to them. And they schedule, I think, 2 or 3 a day, and they go to these different communities, and they'll either go from room to room to visit all the registered voters in the facility, or they'll set up in a community area with all the equipment for assistive technology and replacement ballots and ballot boxes so voters can turn in their ballot in that ballot box.
Okay, I'm gonna move us along because we have gotten a couple more questions, and they are really, really interesting and really wonderful questions. Okay, so regarding to electronic vote by mail, or electronic mail voting, excuse me, verbatim, in Oregon and Maryland, voters can request electronic ballots. How much more accessible is this option, and has it increased voter turnout by those with disabilities?
So those are two really good questions. And I believe, yes, Maryland now has that option. Actually, our same vendor, I believe, was involved in that. And so how much more accessible is the alternate format ballot? That's a really good question. So I think, I work a lot with the National Federation of the Blind and ACB. And for people who are involved in Savvy and who are used to using their own assistive technology, it's great because they get it in their email, they know to go on the website. For people who are used to that, it is a great option. It's in their privacy and convenience of their own home. For voters that the technology could work for who are not used to using that assistive technology, I think that there's a little bit more of a barrier because, for example, you might know that if you go to a polling place, the accessible voting unit will be there. Well, since we don't have polling places here, people just don't know about it. So that's one thing we've focused our partnership efforts with the elections division and in our own outreach and education efforts is getting that information out there, because if there's not users, we can't iron out the kinks. So I think that it's both more accessible and potentially less accessible. And as for whether it's increased voter turnout, that is hard to say because those ballots are not tracked separately. They come back to the elections office with all the other ballots. They're counted with all the other ballots, which is an important aspect of private and independent voting, that they're not segregated from other ballots. There's no way to track who's using that technology. I've asked the elections division to give me feedback on how many users are clicking on the mark my ballot thing, and they say they can't give it to me, or they don't have that data. So I've actually still been working on trying to get some kind of data with them, but even that would only say who clicked it, not who actually printed it out and turned it in. So I think a better measure is probably the amount of outreach that's going on with the elections division. So, but I think people tend to go for like I said before, go for the in-person assistance because that's what they're used to. Hopefully that answers your question. Thank you.
This, I think, will be our last question. In my area, the largest and toughest barrier to voting is self-imposed, and that is apathy. Are there materials offered to address this issue?
This is Zach. I'm happy to start quickly before the other panelists jump in. I think that's a great question. And what we have tried to do through the Rev Up campaign is to really connect voting to other issues and services that people with disabilities care about. So we have our Rev Up Issues Guide, for example, that highlights some of the major legislation or regulations or budgetary issues that really have an impact on the ability of people with disabilities to live independently, to work, to access healthcare services. These are all things that our elected officials vote on. That guide in particular is pretty focused on the federal level, but I always, when this question comes up, I like to give the example of a state House of Delegates race in Virginia last year that literally tied between the two candidates. It was a literal tie, and I think they drew names out of a hat to determine who would get the seat. And in that instance, it also determined which party would have control of the House. So it literally came down to, it could have been one vote that swung one way or the other for a party to have control in the state, and that, can really shape what laws get passed or what don't, budgetary issues. So, it's hard. I think people think about the federal elections and president, and there are so many votes that won, how could that possibly matter? But especially as you look down the ballot in some of these state races and especially local races, your vote really does have an impact. And there are plenty of elections that are very, very close and come down to only a handful of votes. So I think having, a lot of this to counteract apathy is when people bring this up, when voters bring that up, having conversations with them and trying to make them realize the issues that they care about, the services that they access are all tied into voting and the people who are elected.
Zach, this is Mark. I want to add to that too. From a personal standpoint, that I was on a college campus the other day and was watching some students try to register voters, and the remarks that I heard from the students passing by were, well, we don't care, or I don't care about this or that, and so forth. It seems like unless we hit home with the issues that do affect people, with the students, it'd be the stance on student loans these days and what's going on with student loans. So you've got, it seems to me that, and what we're trying to do as a statewide P&A is organize events in different areas around the state and so forth with different crowds and different views and so forth, that we can kind of hammer home some of the information and some of the issues that are affecting people.
Thanks, Mark. Well, thank you to all of our presenters for giving their time and sharing their knowledge and experience. And thank you to everyone who joined today's webinar to listen in. I hope everybody gets registered, makes a plan, and goes out to vote on November 6th. Thanks.